I wasn't looking for buried cities when I found out that a 5-story hotel, 35,000 tons of brick and glass, was raised 8 feet off the ground in 4 days without cracking a single wall. Not demolished, not rebuilt, raised. Hydraulic jacks, thousands of them arranged under the foundation. Hundreds of men working in coordination across the entire block. Guests still inside. Business still running. And when it was done, what had been the ground floor was underground. That detail is in the engineering journals from 1860. It's not contested. George Pullman, before he became the railroad magnate, made his early reputation coordinating this effort. It's documented extensively. And it's the detail that broke everything else open for me. Chicago 1855 to 1860. The city raised itself, not metaphorically, literally. The entire downtown district elevated between 4 and 14 feet. Streets, sidewalks, hotels, office blocks, all of it lifted while people were inside them, while business continued. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think we don't. We say Industrial Revolution and we move on. We say 19th century ingenuity and we file it. But I started asking a simpler question. Why? Why did a city need to raise itself? What was wrong with where it was? The official answer is drainage. Chicago sat on poorly drained clay soil, and the city was drowning in its own waste. Streets flooded, sewers backed up, typhoid swept through repeatedly. The solution was to build a proper sewer system above the existing street grade, then raise everything to meet it. Practical, rational, engineering logic responding to a public health crisis. Except, and this is where it starts to unravel, the moment you accept that Chicago raised itself 4 to 14 feet in the 1850s, you have to accept something else. The original ground floor is now underground. Every building that stood before the lifting has a buried story. Rooms, corridors, staircases, windows that once looked out onto street level, now facing packed earth. I found photographs of it. Not photographs of the raising itself, now photographs of what was revealed during subsequent excavations in the following decades. Finished rooms, plastered walls, intact fireplaces, tile floors, not rubble, not ruin. Rooms that look as if someone simply lowered the ceiling by 12 feet and kept the furniture. I walked through it on a weekday afternoon. The Pedway, Chicago's underground walkway system, has sections where you are standing in what was, in 1854, an above-ground street. Above you, 12 feet of Chicago. Around you, finished plaster walls, original iron fixtures, the outline of a corridor that was at eye level when Lincoln was still practicing law. Not a construction void, not a maintenance tunnel, a room. The kind of room someone swept and lit and walked through on the way to work. I stood in it for a long time, because it's one thing to read that the city raised itself, it's another to stand in what it raised itself over. This is in the Chicago History Museum, this is in the municipal engineering records. It is not fringe, it is accessible on any Tuesday afternoon. And then I asked the obvious question that I'm surprised the engineering retrospectives didn't ask more loudly. If Chicago did this, if one American city physically elevated itself to solve a drainage problem, did other cities encounter the same drainage problem? And if so, what did they do about it? The answer, when I started pulling the records, was not what I expected. Other cities didn't raise themselves, they didn't need to, because the sediment came to them. I want to be precise here because this is where the terrain shifts from documented engineering history into something the records acknowledge but refuse to analyse. What I found when I pulled the subway construction documents, not conspiracy sources, the actual municipal excavation records, are available through city archives and through the published histories of the engineering firms that built these systems, is that virtually every major city that dug a subway system in the 19th and early 20th century encountered the same thing. A buried layer, somewhere between 1 and 2 meters below the contemporary street grade, a stratum that contained evidence of prior occupation, not rubble, not the chaotic debris field of gradual urban accumulation. Finished construction. In London, the Metropolitan Railway, in the world's first underground railway, opened 1863. cut through it repeatedly in the central districts. The engineering reports, which survive in the London Metropolitan Archives, document finding finished brick foundations below the then current street level. The language is clinical. Prior urban fabric. Earlier construction episodes. Archaeological material of uncertain date. The construction schedule was tight and the project moved on, and moves on. In Paris, Baron Haussmann's renovation of the city, running from 1853 through the 1870s, required massive excavation throughout the central arrondissements. The engineers found it there as well, windows beginning below what was now street level, doorways that opened into compacted earth. Haussmann himself, in his published memoir, refers briefly to encountering vestiges of former street levels during excavation in the Ile de la Cité. One paragraph, he attributes it to centuries of urban accumulation, and moves on. Watch for that phrase, because it's going to keep appearing. That attribution, centuries of gradual accumulation, is the official answer everywhere. And for any individual city, it's not obviously wrong. Cities do accumulate. Streets do rise gradually from deposited debris. Rome is famously meters above its ancient self. London's Walbrook River was paved over and built on incrementally over centuries. We understand this process, but here is what the gradual accumulation explanation doesn't account for. The consistency. Natural sedimentation is not consistent. It pools in low points. It thins over elevated ground. It varies with drainage patterns, with proximity to water sources, with the specific construction history of each block, each neighbourhood. Walk through any city that has been professionally excavated and the archaeological layers are irregular, variable, and chaotic in the way that human occupation is chaotic. Messy. Different depths in different locations, different material compositions across short distances. What the engineers found under Paris, under London, under Moscow, under Buenos Aires, under St. Petersburg, under Melbourne, what keeps appearing in the excavation records when you read them carefully enough, is not that. It is something closer to uniform. A band of material at a consistent depth, running across city centres that have entirely different geological substrates, different natural drainage profiles, different histories of occupation. Paris sits on limestone, London sits on river clay, Moscow sits on glacial till, Buenos Aires sits on sedimentary plain, Melbourne sits on basalt plain. These are geologically different environments. Main natural sedimentation should produce different profiles in each of them. The buried layer does not cooperate with this expectation. I found the Moscow case particularly striking because Soviet engineering was meticulous. The Moscow metro, begun in 1930 under the direct supervision of Lazar Kaganovich, is one of the most thoroughly documented infrastructure projects of the 20th century. The Soviet state kept records of everything. Worker accounts were collected, engineering surveys were preserved, the project history was extensively published, and buried within that documentation, not hidden, simply unremarked upon, in the way that bureaucracies don't remark on things they don't know how to classify, are references to what the workers found during excavation in certain districts. In the Arbat, which in areas near what is now Biblioteca Imeni Lenina Station, finished construction at depth, material inconsistent with the documented history of those neighbourhoods. Kaganovich mentions it once in his published memoirs in a single sentence, using the phrase earlier infrastructure. There is no follow-up. The workers who gave the most detailed accounts were reassigned to other sections of the project. If you've been following this channel, if you've watched the videos on the Dark Day, on the giants, on the architecture, what I'm about to show you is going to land differently than anything I've covered so far. Consider subscribing before the next section, because where this goes is somewhere I kept setting aside, something I wasn't sure I was ready to put on record. I think I'm ready now. In Buenos Aires, the construction of the Subte, South America's first underground railway, opened 1913, encountered it in the central sections below the Avenida de Mayo. The construction reports describe anomalous compaction at a consistent depth. The engineers adjusted their tunnelling approach and continued, and moves on. In Melbourne, foundation work for major civic buildings in the 1880s repeatedly broke through what the contractors described as prior fill at consistent depths across the central grid. Melbourne was, by official record, a settlement of fewer than 50 years at that point. The prior fill is attributed to early colonial construction debris, which raises its own question. How much construction debris does a 50-year-old colonial outpost generate? And why is it so consistently distributed and moves on? Now here is what no one says out loud. London, Paris, Moscow, Buenos Aires, Melbourne. These cities share almost nothing geologically. They are on different continents, different substrates, different hemispheres. The only thing that produces a consistent sediment depth across environments that different is not centuries of independent urban accumulation happening to converge on the same range. It is a single depositional event, or a closely timed series of events. Once you understand that, once you see the layer underneath city after city after city, all at the same depth, all containing the same quality of prior construction, all noted in the same clinical language and left uninvestigated, you cannot look at a city the same way again. Every basement window sitting below street grade, every old building where the ground floor feels slightly sunken, every threshold you have to step down to cross, you're not imagining it. The street came up. The question is what it came up over. If you are watching this series and you are new to it, if this is your first encounter with what I've been documenting across these videos, I want to invite you to do something. Go look up the substrate surveys for your own city. Not conspiracy sources, municipal engineering records, the published histories of your city's water and sewer system, the construction documentation for whatever subway or underground infrastructure exists where you live. Look for the phrases engineers use when they don't know what to classify. Prior urban fabric, earlier construction episodes, anomalous compaction, material of uncertain date. You'll find them. In almost every major city that has been excavated, the layer is consistent. The language for dismissing it is consistent. The lack of follow-up is consistent. The mud is still there. Whatever deposited it is not going anywhere. Now let me ask the questions the engineering records cannot answer. What deposited the sediment? Not in Chicago. We know what happened there. The city raised itself deliberately and left precise documentation of exactly how. But in London, in Paris, in Moscow, in Buenos Aires, what process deposited a uniform layer of sediment averaging 1 to 2 meters deep across thousands of square kilometers of urban area within a time frame tight enough that we can still date the material to a recognizable historical window? Not centuries. If it were centuries, the profile would be variable. If it were centuries, we would have documentation of the process. People living through the gradual encroachment of rising street grades would write about it, would raise their thresholds, would complain to city councils. We have none of that. We have cities where the ground floor is underground, and no contemporary account of watching it become underground. What was at street level before the sediment arrived? The buried layer isn't empty. Workers who have cut through it, subway workers, utility contractors, foundation engineers, consistently describe encountering finished surfaces, paved areas, laid brickwork in deliberate patterns, not the rough construction of early settlement, the work of a city that had been operating at that grade before whatever covered it came down. Who lived there? Gradual. Natural accumulation over centuries would be lived through, written about, complained about, legislated around. We have cities where finished rooms are now a metre underground, and no social history of those rooms being buried. The people who walked those streets left no account of the street rising around them, because whatever buried it was not gradual. Why is the depth consistent across cities with entirely different geological substrates? Paris and Moscow and Buenos Aires do not share the natural conditions that would produce identical sedimentation profiles. The only thing that would produce a consistent depth across different geological contexts is a single depositional event. Not centuries of independent urban accumulation happening to converge on the same range. Why did so many subway projects, in cities on opposite sides of the world in a roughly 50-year construction window between 1860 and 1910 encounter the same layer: the London Underground, the Paris Metro, the New York Subway, the Berlin U-Bahn, the Moscow Metro, the Buenos Aires Subte. Every one of them broke through this layer. Not one of them stopped to compare notes with the others. Not one engineering retrospective I have found asks the obvious question: if the same buried layer appears under cities on 6 continents, what does that tell us about the event that created it? And why? This is the question that hasn't left me. Why is there no comparative study? Urban archaeology as a discipline has serious institutional infrastructure. We have comprehensive archaeological studies of London's buried layers. We have detailed analysis of what lies beneath Paris. They exist in isolation from each other. There is no institution, no academic department, no international body asking whether the consistency of the buried layer across global cities is itself data, whether the uniformity means something. The anomalous compaction isn't mentioned again, and moves on. The silence on that question, when you start listening for it, is everywhere in this field. I want to be clear about where my certainty ends, because I think intellectual honesty matters more in this kind of investigation than in any other. I can document the buried layer. That is not contested. Engineers documented it, workers encountered it. It appears in the records of every major excavation project if you look. What I cannot prove, what I am not going to claim I can prove, is what deposited it, or how quickly, or what was functioning at that level before it was covered. The evidence suggests something faster than gradual accumulation. The consistency suggests something global. The quality of what's buried suggests something built. Official history absorbs each piece of this separately: gradual accumulation, independent development, local geology, normal urban processes. And if you take each piece in complete isolation, those answers are not obviously wrong. It's only when you look at the full picture, a consistent buried layer across 6 continents within the same historical window containing the same quality of prior construction, tie-ins with the same absence of documentation for how it got there, that the coincidences accumulate faster than any single explanation can absorb them. This series has been tracing a window, roughly 1780 to 1850. A period when something ends and something else begins, when maps are redrawn, when buildings appear without construction records, when atmospheric events cluster without adequate natural explanations, when a civilization-sized set of infrastructure, sewers, roads, administrative buildings, canal systems, appears across the world simultaneously with no documented construction phase. The buried layer is the physical evidence underneath all of it, literally underneath it. And what I find most remarkable about it, what distinguishes this piece of the investigation from everything else in this series, is that you don't have to trust me. You can go and see it. If you are in London, find a building from before 1860 in the central districts. Look at the basement windows, count how many are partially or fully below current street level. The streets were raised, the official record confirms this. The question is what was already there when the street began to rise. If you are in Paris, walk through any of the older arrondissements and look at where ground floor windowsills sit relative to the pavement. In buildings that predate Haussmann, you will find windows whose sills meet or fall below street grade. The building didn't sink, the street came up, which means behind those windows is a room that is now, for practical purposes, underground. If you are in Chicago, the Pedway is accessible from several downtown entrances. The city is above you. The prior city is around you. I started this investigation looking at a footnote about drainage problems and hydraulic jacks. I found a pattern that no natural gradual geological explanation adequately accounts for at scale. A consistent buried layer, across continents at consistent depths, containing evidence of prior occupation, with no surviving account of how it got there. The buildings are still down there. Finished rooms, intact walls, windows looking into packed earth. The people who lived in those rooms left no record of watching their world get covered. The official history of the cities built above them does not explain what was standing before the ground, rose. But the layer itself remains. This weekend, in your city, you are standing on it. What was at street level before the sediment came? Whose city is now a metre underground? And why, in every place we have dug deep enough to find the answer, do we find the same layer, ask no coordinated questions, and move on? The next video goes into the buildings that were already standing when the new cities were supposedly being built, and why the construction photographs don't exist for the period they should cover most heavily. I've been sitting on that one for a while. It's time.